Kinesthesia sobre el arte cinético latinoamericano en la década de los 50s y 60s y alrededores, una exhibición internacional inspirada en el medio ambiente. Le doy la palabra a Dan.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Can you hear me okay? I've tried to keep the microphone very close to my mouth. Everyone okay in the back? First of all, I just want to thank ZsONAMACO for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about these projects. As a curator, I have been working in Latin America more or less for 25 years, since the early 90s. When I say working in Latin America, however, what I'm mostly referring to is research. I've done a lot of travel throughout the continent. I've been working a lot in international biennials, and in the context of which I've invited numerous younger Latin American artists to participate in those biennials. When I was at the New Museum in New York, I organized several anthological exhibitions of artists like Sylvia Rivas, Eugenio Ditborn, Jose Antonio Hernandez Diaz, among others. But most of the time I haven't really worked in Latin America. So when I've come to Latin America, it seems like all that I've been doing is looking, studying, and taking away. And in the last 12 months, several projects have all come together and coincided so that I'm not doing one, I'm actually doing three exhibitions simultaneously, two of which are happening in Latin America, and one of which is the first exhibition I've ever done in which I'm actually using the phrase Latin America, which I promised myself I would never do, and yet I'm doing it anyway. So I'm going to start them in the order of most recent exhibitions. As mentioned in the introduction, I was invited to be the curator for the 13th Bienal de Cuenca in Ecuador. Cuenca is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, among other things. And the reason it has this designation has a lot to do with the image I'm showing you. Its location at the confluence of three major rivers in the foothills of the Andes made it a very, very important place for the conquest and for the continuing extraction of wealth from Ecuador to be exported by the Spanish, very often to China, as it turns out, by way of Acapulco, which is another story. But this city was built with fortresses and churches, and they're very solid. There was a lot of wealth because of its halfway station between the mines and the ports. And so this wealth went into building lavish monasteries, convents, and cathedrals, among other things, most of which have now faded to kind of semi-relevance in the last generations or so. That's not to say that Cuenca is any less Catholic than it used to be, but I think even during colonial times, the proportion of churches to people was abnormally low, had a very abnormally low ratio. So as part of the UNESCO World Heritage designation, all buildings that constitute Patrimonio Nacional, when they fall out of their commercial use, they must be used for cultural purposes, and nothing but cultural purposes, which means art, exhibitions, musical concerts, poetry readings, and not much more. So the wealth of architectural history that Cuenca has is balanced by the fact that there are all these spaces which are now neutral in the sense that they are being converted to cultural spaces. What I'm showing you right now is one of the largest buildings in the city of Cuenca. It is currently designated as the future Museo de la Ciudad. Nobody knows when this Museo de la Ciudad will open. They have only now emptied it out of the history and, of course, left the historical surfaces and paintings untouched. So what struck me when I was asked to do the biennial was, well, it's fascinating that these historical monuments, which continue to exist today, are nonetheless kind of emptied of that history. The history is neutralized, if you want. And so I began to think about history. and the permanence of history, or rather the impermanence of historical activities. And I came upon the Museo de las Medicinas, which was another monastery that was given to the University of Cuenca, which gave it to its medical faculty. So the medical faculty, which had all of the teaching space and rooms that they needed, said, well, this will now be our museum. So the Museo de las Medicinas is room after room after room of a beautiful, beautiful 18th century porticoed space, which is filled up with doctors' old medical equipment. There is no history of medicine. There is no breakthroughs of science. It is not there to teach us about how medicine was practiced in Cuenca over the years. It is simply a repository of what you see here, a kind of a waiting room area with lots of artifacts, skulls, bones, old instruments. And like many of the museums in Cuenca, nobody goes. There is no audience for this museum. And so part of my job as curator is to visit the space and of course to hear what the people are saying to me, which is, well, we'll take all of this stuff out. We'll empty the spaces so that you can make your biennial. And so one of the quandaries that's facing me now is that I don't think I really want to do that. I think what I want to do is find a way to integrate contemporary art into these somewhat anachronistic museum structures and have the artists intervene directly in these spaces so that the artwork is slightly camouflaged or hidden within the different spaces. So with that said, let me show you some of the artists whose work I'm planning to present in the exhibition. This is a bad slide, I took it myself, of an installation work by a Los Angeles artist named Kristen Morgan. Kristen Morgan is not an artist who works with found materials. Although it looks like found materials, she is a ceramist. She makes all of her objects, every detail, everything you're looking at, every piece of wood, every comic book, paint can, everything is fired clay, which she paints and elaborates to look, to develop into these sort of assemblage constructions that have strong references to childhood or that seem to be a kind of an imaginary artistic installation if somebody was living in the back of your closet and accumulating things that you were throwing away over time and making a little private museum there. So this idea of the impermanent or the transitory is driving a lot of my interest in the artists that I'm selected. This is the work of a couple who live in Montreal, Richard Igby and Marilou Lemons. This is a piece called Prophets, which is spelled like the prophets from the Bible, but the reference is to the market. What they do is they transform current market information about stocks going up and stocks going down, all kinds of pie charts and graphs relating to contemporary finance, and remake them as flimsy, cardboard, kind of neo-constructivist assemblages. They've made many, many dozens of them over the years, and they kind of lay them out on card tables as if all of this financial history that's swirling around us and creating and determining the conditions that we live in is in fact malleable and perishable. It can be turned into nothing with the stroke of a hand. The artist Kader Attia is an Algerian artist who's brought up in Paris and now lives in Berlin. His art has to do entirely with the repair of historical artifacts. He believes that the idea of keeping the past as something perfect is an illusion, that in fact broken noses, broken arms, broken pieces of the past are what actually authenticates the history of that piece. So over time, what he's been trying to do is look for these statues, evidence of the past that's been broken, and step in a way so that it can become repaired. This is the work of Oscar Camilo de las Flores, an artist from El Salvador who lives and works in Oaxaca currently. His primary medium is pen on paper. He spends months making a single drawing that are packed with extremely detailed figures, usually dozens of figures, twisting, contorting, trying to escape, trying to get past each other. It's kind of the struggle of human nature as experienced throughout history, but realized almost on the level of a Rodin, where the tragedy of the human spirit is actually experienced in a way that's quite tactile, but at the same time, because it's on paper, the fragility of the materials is ever present. This is Mexico City artist Pablo Rascado, whose work is maybe familiar to many of you. What I've been interested in, what Rascado does, is this kind of destruction and rebuilding, or rather the building and the breaking down of structures that are only meant to be experienced visually or perceptually when they're in a position either of half destruction or half disappearance. So again and again in his work, he uses this illusion of something that was once perfect, that is in the process of being brought back to a healthy state from some earlier period of deterioration. And like many of the artists, Pablo Rascado is creating a new installation for Cuenca, for the Bienal. One of the things that I think I'd like to mention parenthetically is that when you work in Ecuador doing an international biennial, you are very aware that you're not working in Venice. You're not working in Sao Paulo. You're in a structure in which all decisions of production, transport, materials have to be weighed very carefully because of the limited resources that are available and the need to apply many of those resources to parts of the biennial that are not necessarily about the artworks. So many of the artists that I've been talking to really would prefer to come to Cuenca and make work on site. This is the artist Tiffany Cheung, who lives and works in Vietnam. She has spent almost all of her artistic career making very delicate embroideries using maps of places of military conflict around the world. In Documenta in the Venice Biennale this past summer, she showed a number of maps of the Syrian conflict. This is actually a map, an aerial map showing refugee camps on the outskirts of the country. This is a map that shows the incidence and concentration of deaths. So where you see the red circles, that's where the greatest concentration of deaths. This is information that we don't share using aesthetic means, just as we don't use aesthetic means to share ideas about the stock market. And yet this artist believes that the fragility, the beauty of what she's trying to present and the tragedy behind the story cannot be separated, that they are one and the same thing. This is the work of Adan Vallecillo, who lives and works in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. His work has historically dealt with the missionary and colonization problematics in his country. This particular work, which was shown at the Orange County Museum of Art, where I used to work 2 years ago, deals with the history of the natural rubber industry in Honduras, especially during the early age of the automobile, when it wasn't quite determined that tires for Henry Ford's cars would actually be made from synthetic rubber. And there was a brief moment when it looked like Honduras's financial future could change very much for the better. And what he's done instead is made a giant minimalist-looking mural using hundreds of fragments of repaired inner tubes. Tegucigalpa has bad streets, lots of hills, so people's tires are constantly being blown out and repaired over and over again. So what he does is use this language of monumentality to talk about deprivation, poverty, and historical bad luck, and how these have all combined to create a particular reality in actual life in Honduras today. This is the work of Youssef Mehdi. It's actually a proposal that he's made for us for the biennial, which is a three-way poetry generating machine where you and two other spectators enter a room, you're facing a camera, and as you move and gesticulate, the camera interprets your movements in the selection of words to create poetic phrases. So as you change your position in front of the work or inside of the work, what happens is the poetry that's being generated by your movements changes as well. This is Enrique Oliveira from Brazil, who creates site-specific installations using natural wood. And he's particularly interested in kind of refining the point where something that appears very natural, part of a forest, is blending with something that's industrially made. So this is an installation he made in Sao Paulo a couple years ago. This is a exhibition that was in Paris about 6 months ago, where the pillars that define the space architecturally are in fact false. They've been introduced in order to fool your eye into seeing this development, this transformation into tree limbs as it goes further up in height, appears to be something that's beyond belief or almost surreal. And in fact, it takes place because the artist has introduced architectural elements that are hollow and kind of the false version of the real architectural elements that are surrounding the installation. Lucia Koch, who's also from Brazil, has been working the last several years in creating site-specific installations using panels of color-filtered glass that are simply leaned against walls, distributed around interiors in order to make dramatic transformations in natural light. So she works best in a space that has lots of illumination, where the colored lights really act as a pass-through for the light, and a lot of the aesthetic qualities of the work are perceived in the surrounding area around the installation. And this is a tree by Miller Lagos, who's a young artist working in Bogota. Lagos did this project for the Site Santa Fe Biennial 2 summers ago. He asked, it was kind of about a joke that somebody made to him once where they were talking about recycling paper. And he said, well, what do you do with recycled paper? Do you just go and make trees out of them? Wouldn't that be the ideal? So when he got to Santa Fe, he asked to do a recycling project where people would take the free newspapers that you get having sales and local things and save them. And so for 2 weeks, he just saved these papers up, and in the end created a giant volume and using a chainsaw cut the pile of newspapers to form a tree in the middle of the exhibition space. So as you get close to it, what appears to be wood or bark, and in fact was derived from a tree, is again in this kind of transitional stage between being a natural thing and something that's entirely man-made. So I've tried to give you maybe 15 artists, a little bit of an introduction to how the exhibition is going to be generated. Rather than pause now and ask for questions about the Cuenca Biennial, I thought I would move on to the second and third examples. When I was in Buenos Aires in August of 2012, I saw an exhibition there that had a very profound impact on me called Real Virtual, Kinetic art from Argentina from the 1960s. And I don't know if there are any curators in the room, but one of the things that you want to do as a curator is find exhibitions that you really respond to that contains new historical information that you didn't have before. And of this exhibition, Real Virtual, of the 20 artists in the exhibition, I did not know 19 of them when I walked in. I only knew Julio Leparc. That was it. And so this exhibition really made me think about a history that in the United States we don't have. This information is not available to us. It's a lost history. There are reasons why, which I don't really want to get into. But in the end of 2017, the Getty Foundation, as many of you probably know, is funding about 40 individual museum exhibitions in different museums. I'm curating this exhibition called Kinesthesia that links artists throughout Latin America working with kinetic art from 1954 until 1969. And this is the exhibition that I that I used the term Latin American for, even though I've never wanted to use that term in describing a group of art. But the reason I think it's okay to do it in this case is because there never really was any such thing as Latin American kinetic art. In other words, there was a movement in Argentina, there was a movement in Venezuela, there were a lot of expatriate South American artists in Paris, there were individual artists working in Brazil, working in Cuba, working in Chile, but there was never a movement. It was separated by thousands of miles, and very often strong cultural differences. So the development of the exhibition, in part, had to do with fabricating a history that never existed. What you're looking at right now is Gyula Kosice, an artist who is now 92 years old, living and working in Buenos Aires. He came to Argentina when he was 8 years old. By the time he was 12, he was an orphan, and by the age of 14, he was basically living in bookstores. That is how he's a complete autodidact. He never learned anything about making art or reading or writing, but he's published about 60 books of his poetry and philosophy and had dozens of exhibitions, and is the first artist in all of Latin America to incorporate movement in his art. By 1942, he was making works involving magnets and water that moved constantly, a kind of a perpetual motion machine. Because of his sort of outsider status in South American art history, and the fact that he's never collaborated in a constructive way with galleries, means that a lot of this history has been kind of covered up over time. This is one of his hydraulic machines that he's made. It's actually in the LACMA collection in Los Angeles. And this is Kosice in 1966, creating one of his giant water mobiles on a massive outdoor space in Buenos Aires, focusing on this kind of public movement of water through plexiglass forms using illumination at the same time, a kind of a futuristic vision that's almost amazing to believe is really from that long ago. Probably his most famous work is La Ciudad Hidroespacial. Kosice has always believed that mankind will not end living on the earth, that mankind will actually end floating over the surface of the earth. So for the last 50 years, he's been designing these floating cities that in the future will be suspended over giant bodies of water, and that will be the future of civilization. I'm just showing one small mobile of this, but Kosice, in many ways, is a turning point in the history of modernism, certainly in Latin America. And one of the issues that have come up historically in his work has to do with the effort to remake some of the pieces from the 40s and 50s again in the 80s and the 90s. This, of course, is Jesus Soto. Soto is the first acknowledged Latin American master of kinetic art, and his work is the earliest work in the exhibition. By 1954, Soto was making movement-oriented pieces, kinetic works, that when you walked back and forth or got close and then backed away, would create moire patterns that were very visually dynamic. After he moved to Paris, Soto became one of the participating artists in the 1955 exhibition at the Galerie Denis René in Paris that launched the kinetic art movement called Le Mouvement. And Soto really from that point on was one of the leaders in developing this discourse about how the spectator's movement creates a passive kineticism, a passive kinetic energy. Nothing in a Soto moves by itself, but when you move, the piece suddenly dives into action. And at the very, very end of the 60s, which is where the exhibition ends, he began making his most famous body of work, the penetrables, which fill architectural spaces and in which the viewer actually enters inside this space and is surrounded by movement, but again, movement that's been generated by their passage through the space. You cannot perceive the work without changing it and making it go into movement. One of the true discoveries for me in this exhibition was the work of Abraham Palenik, who is a Brazilian artist who grew up in Palestine and came back to Brazil when he was already an adult and he had studied modernist painting, but by 1949, he had decided that he did not want to be a traditional artist, that he was going to spend his time finding a new use of materials to make modern art. In 1951, he was invited to make an installation for the first Biennale of Sao Paulo. And what he created was the first of what he calls synchromatic devices. In this case, it was an installation set into the wall with dozens of motors, moving parts, colored lights, fans, bands of conveyor belts that generated movement, and then covering all of it was a screen. So what you as the spectator saw was through an opaque or just kind of translucent surface so that you couldn't see the source of the imagery. All you saw were the effects, these special gyrating and pulsating forms that seemed to generate within these boxes. It's one of the most extraordinary body of work, I think, from the middle of the 20th century. And it's even rarer, in a sense, because he only made about 25 of them. And of those 25, there's about 18 or 19 that are still extant. Just to give you an idea of what creates the image you just saw, this is what happens when you dismantle one of the synchromatic devices. So the level of mechanic invention and electrical wiring today to contemporary eyes seems unbelievably primitive. And yet the effects that he got by making these synchromatic devices is visually sophisticated to a point where it still looks futuristic to us 60 years after the fact. And of course, Julio Leparc is probably the most celebrated living, in fact, he is the most celebrated living artist who was involved in the early years of kinetic art. By 1959, 1960, Leparc was in Paris developing the Lumière movement, in which it was the lights that moved. It wasn't moving parts, it was the lights themselves. So the boxes that he created very often were blown by fans. There were turning mirrors around them, very often connected to elaborate motors, again, contraptions in the interior of the work that created very powerful visual effects. And then sometimes the kinetic pieces that he made were very, very simple. Two metal bands contorting against each other with one motor that just pushes them against each other. So the natural contortion of the metal continues to bend and fold and undulate in completely unexpected patterns. So even a simple piece like this one is incredibly sophisticated. And by the end, Leparc is making installations, maquettes, in which the kind of hanging of multiple parts, screens and discs and small metal squares would respond to the breeze. So as you walked by it or anything happened to change the air currents, the piece would respond by generating movement. And I guess the last master of kinetic art to mention is, of course, Carlos Cruz Diez, Venezuelan artist who continues to be very active today. He lives between Paris and Panama. This is one of his chromosaturation chambers, which long before Dan Flavin or Robert Irwin or any of the space and light artists that Southern California is celebrated for, he made chambers, multiple chambers, in which the spectator entered a space that was perceptually transformed in a very dramatic way by the colored lights that saturated each room. And the piece has to be experienced sequentially, where you go from one colored room to the next, to the next, to the next, and finally exit out the other door. In the course of my research, I've come across numerous artists who, again, I'd never heard of before starting this project, and who I fear are in danger of being forgotten if they're not looked at again soon. This is Marta Boto, who died about 5 years ago in Paris. She and her husband moved there in the late 40s and then moved back to Argentina and then moved back to Paris when everything was already very much underway. Marta Boto's very elegant, ballet-like kinetic works were very sought after in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then towards the end of her life, the exhibitions really stopped happening. And I don't believe there's been a one-person exhibition of her work in a very long time. But fortunately, there are collections throughout the United States and South America to be borrowed from. Gregorio Veronica. Veronica was an Italian immigrant to Argentina in the 40s, who was a very experimental abstract painter in the late 40s, and he developed what he called virtual architecture in the late 50s. So this is an early kinetic device that has an almost computerized sequence, but a computerized sequence of lights. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes to go through the whole sequence, but every element changes from light to dark, and then the separations of the bands between them contain lights that continually change color as well as going on and off. So it seems kind of simplistic and maybe very analog for our digital world, but I think in part one of the reasons why this art is so compelling, and especially since it's being presented to American audiences, who have never experienced any of this work really in any depth, I think it shows a kind of optimism for modernity that today we have a little bit of trouble summoning up in such an uncritical way. But at that time, the belief that artistic visions could combine with technology to describe a better future was something that a handful of artists really believed in. And I think it's important now to recognize Latin American artists' achievements as originators in a very important 20th century movement that they helped to create and are only now, I think, being separately recognized for. So as I said before, I'm going to talk about all 3 exhibitions in a row. This is the island of Chiloé, which is just off the southwest coast of Patagonia in Chile. And on my first trip to Santiago, about 25 years ago, I was told by an artist whose work I'm going to show you in a little while that I really should go to Chiloé if I wanted to experience what Chile was like. And a dozen trips later, I finally made it to Chiloé, but this was at the urging of another artist who told me that probably Chiloé is the very best place in the country of Chile to make a contemporary exhibition. And I thought, well, this is a rural environment. It rains 9 months out of the year. The only tourism you have is really backpackers, people who go there to hike. And the only building material is wood. But what was impressed upon me was that during the Pinochet dictatorship, Chiloé built the southernmost museum in the world. They built a museum of modern art in the capital city of Castro, where artists from Santiago could show their work safely. In other words, no one from the central government in Santiago would bother them if they were showing in a place as remote and far away as Chiloé. And to this day, the artists that I've met there all live there because they don't like people. They want to be as far away from society as they possibly can and continue to do their work. So I've made 2 trips to the island in the last year, and I've developed a proposal called Alrededores, surroundings, that deals with the ecological environment of Chiloé. And I'm going to be inviting 10 Chilean artists and 10 foreign artists to participate in the exhibition, which will happen at the end of 2017, while the bachelor government is still in place. And of the Chilean artists, half of them will be based on Chiloé. So just to show you a little bit about how the island works, if you go there today, any tourist brochure you'll find in Chiloé features this artwork, Muelle del Alma, the Pier of the Soul, which was created by a local artist named Chabuco. And this piece is located on the Pacific coast, looking out over the Pacific Ocean in a very remote corner. To get to the work, you have to drive your car, park it, and hike for about 45 minutes through spectacular mountain meadows, and then you finally get to the edge, the coastline, and you're in this very elevated position, and suddenly there's this pier that takes you right off into the middle of nowhere. When you stand at the edge of the pier, it's as if you're about to take off into space. And I thought, well, how strange for a rural environment that already the image, the symbol that they prefer to share to the outside world is a contemporary sculpture made in situ by an artist who's, still in his 30s. He's still young and working. So this will give you a little bit of a look at the kinds of spaces that exist. This is actually the famous MAM Chiloé, the Museo de Arte Moderno. It has no collection. The humidity in the island is such that in order to create a climate-controlled storage situation, there is one in one of the museums in Ancud, but in most of the places it would be so financially prohibitive that they simply don't bother. The work is brought in, it's presented, and it's taken away. The museum itself rots. All wood in Chiloé deteriorates over a period of time, so that already in its 30-year history, the museum has had to be almost entirely rebuilt twice from the beginning. This is an interesting museum that I discovered while I was walking around the capital city of Castro. It's La Ballena Dormida, the sleeping whale, and it was proposed about 15 years ago as the site for the municipal archives and for a maritime museum, because whaling was a very important industry in Chiloé during the early colonial period. The building was never finished. It went over about a couple $100,000. They then budgeted the couple $100,000 to finish the roof. And when they finished the roof, it rained and it leaked everywhere. And apparently there was a mayoral campaign going on at that time. And the candidate for mayor said, "This madness must stop. If you elect me as the mayor, I'll put an end to it." So he was made mayor, and the Ballena Dormida has been sleeping on the coast of Castro for the last 10 years. The Ministry of Culture has, in the last 12 months, stepped in, and as part of a process of trying to create autonomy for Chiloé's cultural policy, is turning this into a Casa de Cultura, which is being earmarked during the period of the exhibition for contemporary art as well. Outside of Castro and Ancud, you find spaces like this one, which is the municipal center of the village of Achao. What we want to do is distribute the artworks throughout the island of Chiloé, so that people who are coming to see it will actually have to get on boats, take ferries, do the things that local people have to do, and visit some of the more remote villages. I'm going to show you a couple of artworks and then kind of wrap it up. This is a self-taught artist named Guillermo Gerdes, whose work I discovered on my first trip. He is the most revered artist on the island of Chiloé. He's in his late 60s. He moved to the island about 40 years ago and has lived in a very remote part of this very remote island for those last 40 years. His career as an artist began by him carving things and bringing the things that he had carved, small wooden statues, to the local artisan market and selling them, and then being able to live off that. He then started drawing, and for the last 25 years, drawing and making constructions from drawings has been his primary medium. He does not show his work commercially, although the museums in the region of Ancud and Castro continue to show him on a regular basis. It's a very fantasy-driven imagination. He peoples his work with very dense spaces, which are then filled with ever-shrinking multitudes of characters and forms. He also works with very mythological shapes. This is the three-headed rooster, which is an important mythic figure in the very particular mythology of Chiloé. This is his half toro, half bull, half clam. So it's kind of a toro almeja. I don't know if I have the bottom part of it. But again, as you move into the interior of the detail on the face, you just kind of step into this very fantasy-driven world. This is another self-taught artist, a grandmother named Sylvia Rivas, who for the last 15 years has been painting full-time. She taught herself, and I think that there's some technical issues that she is working on, but meanwhile she's a very serious artist and is continuing to paint pictures about the history of the island. These are the kind of artists that I want to have international artists come and do collaborative works with. So just to give you a little context, this is Eugenio Dittborn, the artist who told me 25 years ago. It's something you're remembering incorrectly. But this is an installation of his Aeropostale paintings, his paintings which he made again during the dictatorship so that he could send paintings to international exhibitions and get around both the national security infrastructure as well as the international cultural boycott that was on Chile during that time. This is a detail of one of the airmail paintings. And I've invited this artist, American artist Jason Middlebrook, who does work almost entirely in wood and has spent much of the last 5 or 10 years traveling to places around the world, to Sri Lanka, to El Salvador, other places, to work with artisans, to work with people that are already making art full-time out of wood, to sort of introduce his own ideas and perhaps adapt ways of working to ideas that have already been in circulation locally. And then just to tie it back to my last kind of large-scale project, the Prospect New Orleans biennial that I organized in 2008 and 2011, I'm inviting the artist Don Dudot, who's making a body of work about the mothership and how, in contrast to Kosic's prediction, she believes that the only fate for humans is to build very large ships and get us off the planet soon. And so the work that she's been making recently really references ideas about how the mothership will be conceived, what is it of our planet that will take us, that we should take with us to the other planets that we're going to colonize. And then finally, the firemen, the first responders, the safety providers, who, like the rest of us, will all have to function entirely wearing hazmat suits 24 hours a day. So with that description, I'm going to just wrap it up and say that these 3 exhibitions are the main projects that I have. So for me, it's very gratifying that after 25 years of working in Latin America, I can finally actually say that I'm working in Latin America. Thank you all very much for being attentive audience. Are there any questions? Or, yes. I think we have a microphone.
Thank you. Dan, about the Kinesthesia project you mentioned, where will it take place exactly? You mentioned that it's a project that's part of the Getty Foundation, and they're sponsoring several exhibitions in different places.
Yes, they're sponsoring 40 exhibitions from Santa Barbara to San Diego. The official list has not been made, but we're a very small group and we're intimate, and no one's going to be revealing this. But the Palm Springs Art Museum, which is about 60 miles outside of Los Angeles, and a real bastion of mid-century design and architecture, will host the exhibition. And it's going to be touring to at least one and perhaps a second American museum. So all these exhibitions will be announced publicly at the end of March, where the Getty will do a large press conference and announce all 40 of the exhibitions at one time. But meanwhile, each museum is working separately on all their specific exhibitions.
And everything in California?
It's just Southern California. So from about 30 or 40 miles north of Los Angeles to about 100 miles south of Los Angeles and about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. Because the Getty's mission is about raising the scholarship and curatorial practice in Southern California to a level that's equivalent to the best museum regions in the world, which it's not. There are many great things to say about the Los Angeles region, but the need for development in the museum field is very strong right now, which is one of the reasons there are so many curators. But this is the Getty's effort to kind of build off of their early Pacific Standard Time project, which looked at modernism in Southern California. In this case, all 40 exhibitions will deal with Latin American modern and contemporary art, and some historical work as well. Another question, comment? Oh.
Yeah, one more thing. I'm just very curious about the Chiloé project. So it's quite far away from Santiago, you mentioned, right?
It's very far from Santiago.
Okay, I'm just trying to picture how will you get people to go and be part of the exhibition and look at the work, and how does it work?
I'm really glad you asked that question because I left that part out. Unlike many other exhibitions that I've done of this type, there is no desire, there's no need or effort to attract outside tourism. There's a limited capacity of hotel rooms, and the exhibition will be opening in the early part of the tourist season, but by the time it ends, it will be peak tourist season. So it's not an exhibition that I'm making in order to get everybody to come to Chiloé. It's too strange a place, in a way, to try to do that. And as I said, very limited. So the exhibition is actually made for the people who live there. And to some degree, because I've never been inspired to work in Santiago, and I don't know where I would do an exhibition, but I wanted to make something important in Chile, something significant. But in this case, everyone from Santiago, if they wanted to see the exhibition, or from New York or Mexico or anywhere, will have to make that trip, because it will be an exhibition that can't happen in Santiago. And it's addressing very much the future risk of natural resources in Chile, which is in a kind of a crossroads right now as to whether they invest in the conservation of their natural resources for the future, or whether they continue to support themselves through extraction industries that have damaged the environment so much in certain parts of the country. So in a way, it's about contributing to a discussion that's happening very, very locally. And it's not that I don't want people to come, it's just that the purpose of the exhibition is different than that. It's more of a local project. Last call for questions. They can be riddles, comments. Nothing? Well, once again, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you to ZsONAMACO. Thank you, Leonardo.